I work the night shift in a mall food court, and I swear to you, customers still arrive even though the entire building is supposed to be closed and locked tight. Pause. At first, I thought it was just drunk teenagers sneaking in, or maybe security guards testing me. But then I noticed they never touched their food. They just sat there, staring at me, chewing nothing, moving their jaws too slow, too deliberate. Slow, tense tone. The first night, I made the mistake of asking one of them if they was okay. It leaned forward, its skin sagging off its skull like wet paper, and whispered something I'll never forget. "You're not supposed to see us." I've learned since then there are rules you have to follow if you want to survive in this food court after midnight. Pause. And the very first one is simple. If a customer shows up after hours, low, tense voice, never serve them. I didn't want this job. Let's start there. I'd been laid off from my old warehouse gig a few towns over, and bills don't stop piling up just because you don't have the cash to pay them. I was desperate. When I saw the listing, overnight attendant, mall food court, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Easy work, steady pay. I thought it was a joke. Who needs someone to watch over a food court at night? Everything closes by 9, sometimes earlier on weekdays, and the shops lock up their registers. But the posting said it plain as day. We require someone on site in the food court during night hours to monitor the premises and provide basic custodial upkeep. I figured it was mall management's way of cutting corners on security and cleaning staff by rolling it into one. And honestly, I didn't care. It was money, and I needed money. Pause. I came in for the interview the very next day. The mall was depressing in the daylight. Half the stores boarded up, a few struggling clothing outlets, a dollar max, a nail salon with a flickering neon sign, and then the food court. You know the kind of place. 4 or 5 options, nothing exciting. A sad little pizza counter, a greasy burger stall, a Chinese place that smelled way too fishy to be trusted, and a coffee stand that looked like it hadn't been updated since 1999. Even in the day, it felt wrong. Like the place had been gutted years ago, and they were just pretending it was still alive. But the manager, a pale, thin guy in a cheap suit named Carson, didn't seem to think anything was odd. He asked if I could work nights, if I could handle being alone, if I wasn't squeamish about cleaning up. I said yes to all of it. He smiled, thin and forced, and slid me a clipboard. There wasn't much paperwork, just a single-page contract. I scanned it fast, and one thing stuck out. In the middle, there was a line in bold that said, "Employee must remain in the food court at all times between the hours of 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. That was unusual, right? No bathroom breaks, no smoke breaks outside. I asked Carson about it, and he just laughed, a short, dry sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, don't worry, we've got restrooms right here, down the hall. You won't need to leave." He tapped the contract with a bony finger. "Just sign, and you're good." Pause. I should have walked away then. But I didn't on my first night. I showed up at 9:45. Carson wasn't there, just a security guard named Miles who barely looked at me when he handed over the keys to the janitor's closet and the little security booth tucked into the corner of the court. "You stay in here," he said. "Keep the lights on. If you see anything, don't leave the food court." I asked what he meant by anything, but he was already walking away. That word stuck with me though. Anything. Not anyone. Not any problem. Just anything. Slow tone. The food court at night was a different beast entirely. Once the last shop closed and the mall speakers stopped piping in their generic instrumental music, silence pressed in like a weight. The overhead fluorescents hummed loud, almost angry, flickering every so often like they resented being awake too. I did a sweep of the tables with a rag, sprayed down the counters, then sat in the booth. There wasn't much to do. I scrolled my phone. I stared at the blank monitors showing dark hallways. I tried to tell myself it was easy money. But then, around midnight, I heard it, the shuffle of footsteps. I froze, listening. It wasn't the security guard. Miles had left ages ago. These footsteps were soft, uneven, like someone dragging their feet across tile. I leaned forward in the booth, squinting through the glass. And sure enough, there was someone standing by the pizza counter. Pause. It was a man. Or at least, it looked like a man. He was wearing a faded hoodie, hands stuffed deep in the pocket, head lowered. He didn't move when I got up. He didn't even acknowledge me. Just stood there. I swallowed hard and stepped out of the booth, calling across the court. "Hey, man, we're closed. You can't be here." My voice echoed too loudly, bouncing off the walls. The figure twitched, then turned its head toward me. I wish it hadn't. His face, if you could call it that, looked stretched, like the skin was too thin over the bone. His eyes were sunken, his mouth slack. He opened it, slow and deliberate, and I expected words. Instead, his jaw just unhinged. Further and further until it hung open like a broken hinge, a wet crack filling the air. Then, he snapped it shut, and without saying anything, shuffled toward one of the tables and sat down. Slow, tense tone. That's when I realized he wasn't here to leave. He was here to eat. I don't know why, but instinct told me to back off. I ducked back into the booth and shut the door, heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I watched him through the glass, watched as he reached for a tray that wasn't there, lifting nothing, setting nothing down, chewing nothing. Over and over, slow, mechanical. He never looked at me again. I stayed frozen until 5:55, when just, like that, he stood up and walked out. I don't even know where he went. 1 second, he was heading toward the bathroom hall. The next, he was gone. When Carson came in at 6 sharp, I stammered out what happened. He didn't look surprised, not even a little. He just adjusted his tie, gave me that thin smile again, and said, "Good, you stayed put. That's the important thing." I asked him what the hell was going on, but he cut me off with a flat look. "You want to keep this job?" I nodded. "Then don't talk to them. Don't serve them. And whatever you do," his voice dropped lower, almost a whisper, "don't leave the food court." I wish I could tell you I quit right then. I tore up the contract and never came back. But money's a hell of a leash. I came back the next night, and the night after that, and every night since. And I've learned, piece by piece, there are rules in that food court. Rules I can't explain, rules that don't make sense, rules that will keep you alive if you follow them. Pause, and if you don't, if you slip up even once, then you'll end up like the ones who sit at those tables, chewing nothing. The second night was worse, though not because of what I saw, because of what I heard. I'd barely been in the booth an hour when the silence of the mall shifted. You know how silence can change? How it stops being absence of sound and becomes presence of something waiting? That's what it felt like. I tried to drown it out with earbuds, but every so often, a faint noise would leak through, a distant shuffle, the sound of a chair sliding across tile when I knew I hadn't moved any, or the whisper of the air system cycling even though the vents had been shut down. By midnight, my nerves were raw. I told myself I'd go do a walkthrough, just to make sure I wasn't going crazy, so I stepped out of the booth and started around the tables. The food court smelled different than it had the night before. Not the usual stale grease and cleaning chemicals, but something sweet, almost syrupy, cloying in the back of my throat. I followed it toward the burger stall, and that's when I heard it. Chewing. Not normal chewing. Wet, animal chewing, sloppy and eager. My stomach dropped. I crept closer and peeked behind the counter, but there was nothing there. Just a flickering fluorescent and an overturned ketchup bottle dripping slow red tears onto the stainless steel. The sound stopped. And then, directly in my ear though I was alone, a voice whispered, "Hungry." Pause, I spun around, my heart seizing. But the court was empty. Not even one of those hollow-eyed customers from the night before. Just me. I backed into the booth, slammed the door, and tried to steady my breathing. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and every few minutes I'd swear I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. Just shadows, probably, but too fast, too deliberate. The rest of that night stretched forever, and I didn't see anyone else come in. But by the time Carson showed up at dawn, I felt half dead. He asked, "Everything quiet?" And I almost laughed in his face. Quiet? My ears were still ringing from that whisper. I told him what I'd heard, and again, he didn't look surprised. He just put a hand on my shoulder, cold and papery, and said, "You did good. You stayed in the booth. That's what matters." He never explained, never reassured, just repeated that same warning. I wanted to push harder, but something in his eyes stopped me. Like if I asked the wrong question, he'd decide I didn't need to know the answer, and I'd never walk out of that mall again. On the third night, I started noticing patterns. Midnight seemed to be the threshold. Before then, it was just the hum of lights and the groan of the building settling. But as soon as the clock struck 12, things shifted. The air grew heavier. The lights flickered more often. And sometimes, there were people, customers. They didn't come in groups, not yet. Just one at a time. Always silent, always slow. They'd choose a table, sit, and mime their meal. Sometimes it was chewing, sometimes sipping. Once, a man in a sharp suit sat across from me and slowly, meticulously cut invisible food with a knife and fork, raising nothing to his lips over and over again. I never served them, never moved, just sat there watching from behind the glass. And every single time, before dawn, they'd disappear, not walk out, just vanish the moment I blinked or turned my head. By the end of that week, I couldn't keep pretending this was just my imagination. Too many things had stacked up. The sweet, syrupy smell came back every night, stronger near the Chinese stall, though I never found the source. Sometimes I'd hear the sound of running oil fryers, though. The switches were off and the power had been cut. Other times, the soda machine by the pizza counter would hiss and gurgle like it was pouring drinks no one had ordered. But the worst was the laughter. It started faint, so faint I thought it was just the mall pipes. But one night around 2 a.m., I heard it clear as day, a child's giggle. Not happy though, not innocent, drawn out, mocking. It echoed through the empty tables until I was clutching my head, muttering to myself to block it out. When it stopped, the silence felt heavier than before, like something had been listening for my reaction. I started drinking coffee by the pot just to keep myself awake, because the nights had a way of dragging me towards sleep, pulling at my eyelids like invisible fingers. Every time my head would start to nod, I'd jolt awake with the fear that if I closed my eyes too long, I'd wake up at one of those tables, chewing nothing, with someone else watching me from the booth. The line between dreams and reality blurred. I'd see reflections in the glass that didn't match the empty room. I'd glance at the clock and see the hands spin too fast, then snap back to the right time. And sometimes, when I dared to look away from the monitors, I'd catch sight of figures moving just beyond the food court boundaries, pacing the dark hallways, never stepping closer. Almost like they were waiting for me to break the one rule Carson kept hammering into my head. Don't leave the food court at BY. The second week, I couldn't take it anymore. I cornered Miles, the security guard, before my shift. I asked him straight up, what the hell is going on in this place? He lit a cigarette, took a long drag, and stared off like he wished I hadn't asked. Finally, he said, "You hear him yet?" I nodded, throat tight. "Then you know enough. You stay in your booth. You don't serve nobody, and you keep your damn mouth shut." I pressed him, asking who they were, why they came. He shook his head. "Ain't for me to say. Ain't for you either. Just rules, man. Rules keep you breathing." Then he flicked the cigarette and walked off without another word. That was the first time I heard anyone besides Carson mention the rules. They kept alluding to them, but never handed me a list, never spelled them out. Like they wanted me to figure it out on my own, piece by piece. Pause. And maybe that was the point. Maybe knowing all the rules at once makes you a target. Still, I started making my own mental notes. Rule 1, obvious, never leave the food court. Rule 2, just as clear, don't serve them, no matter how much they sit and wait. Rule 3, one I wasn't sure about yet, don't speak to them. The one time I tried on the first night had almost cost me my sanity. So I bit my tongue, watched, waited, slow, tense tone. But the thing about rules is, sometimes you don't know you've broken one until it's too late. One night, maybe my 12th or 13th shift, I made that mistake. It was around 3 in the morning, and the air had gone sour. Not sweet anymore, but rotting, clinging to the back of my throat like spoiled meat. I was nodding off, head bobbing, when I heard the sound of a tray clatter onto a table. It startled me awake, and there he was, a teenager, maybe 16, slouched in a chair near the burger stall. His face was pale, his eyes glassy, but unlike the others, he looked directly at me. And then, God help me, he smiled. His teeth were black. Not dirty, not rotten, just pure black like polished stone. My whole body screamed at me not to react, but my mouth betrayed me. "You okay, kid?" The words slipped out before I could stop them. The smile widened. He lifted a hand and pointed at me, slowly, deliberately, like he'd just been waiting for me to acknowledge him. My stomach dropped. Then he whispered something I couldn't hear, lips moving too fast, too strange. I pressed my hands against my ears, but the sound was inside my head, drilling deeper, 1,000 words and 1,000 voices all at once. I don't even remember what happened next. I must have blacked out. All I know is I woke up with my face pressed against the booth glass, blood trickling from my nose, and the kid was gone. That morning, Carson didn't scold me. He didn't fire me. He just looked me over with those cold eyes and said, "You spoke to one." I nodded, ashamed. "You're still here," he muttered. "That's luck. Don't mistake it for forgiveness." Then he walked off, leaving me trembling, wiping dried blood from my lip. That I realized something then. These rules, they weren't arbitrary. They were survival. Every time I slipped, every time I tested them, something tried to take me. And the mall didn't care if I was too tired, too scared, too curious. It only cared if I obeyed. Still, I couldn't keep living in that fog of half-truths. I needed to know the rules, all of them, not just the scraps I'd pieced together. So the next night, when Miles passed me the keys, I asked him flat out, "There's a list, isn't there? A real list. Carson won't tell me, but I know it exists." He froze, jaw tightening. For a second, I thought he'd hit me. But then he sighed, shook his head, and said, "Not my place. But if you're still breathing by the end of the week, maybe you'll earn it." That week nearly broke me. More customers came. Some nights, just one or two. Some nights, whole families, silent and glass-eyed, sitting at tables like mannequins come to life. Their jaws moved in unison, chewing nothing, sipping nothing. And every so often, one would glance toward the booth, as if to check whether I was still watching. I never looked away. I couldn't. I knew if I blinked too long, they'd move closer. And I couldn't risk them touching me. The air grew heavier each night, pressing on my chest until I struggled to breathe. The smells shifted from sweet to rotten to metallic, like copper pennies rubbed raw into my tongue. And sometimes, the food stalls looked wrong. The burger sign flickering to display words I couldn't read, jagged symbols that hurt to look at. The Chinese place's menu scrolling too fast, images of dishes that weren't food at all but raw, pulsing meat. Once, the coffee stand brewed a pot on its own, steam rising, filling the court with the smell of burnt hair. Through it all, I obeyed. I stayed in the booth. I didn't serve them. I didn't speak. And when dawn broke, I stumbled though. I don't know what I expected when Carson finally gave me the folded paper, but I know what I feared. That the rules would confirm what I already suspected, that this job wasn't really a job at all but a sentence, a test, or maybe some kind of trap. And the moment I read them aloud, they'd become binding in ways I couldn't undo. But I opened it anyway, because I was past the point of pretending ignorance was safety. And as my eyes traced the shaky ink, my throat went dry, because the rules weren't suggestions, they weren't guidelines, they were commandments etched in desperation, each one daring me to disobey, just to see what would happen. And though my first instinct was to crumple the page and run, I couldn't, because Carson was staring at me with that thin, graveyard smile, like he was already mourning me. So I read them carefully, line by line, and I'll tell them to you exactly as I saw them. Because if you ever find yourself in that mall, in that food court, and you don't know these rules, you won't last the night, you won't even last an hour. Rule 1. Never leave the food court between the hours of midnight and 6 a.m. Not for any reason, not for a fire alarm, not for screams, not even if you see me or Miles or anyone you know waving you over. Because whatever is calling to you is not what it looks like. It is a lure, and the moment you step beyond the tiled edge of the court, you belong to them, and they don't give you back. Rule 2. If a customer arrives after midnight, do not serve them, do not approach them, do not acknowledge them in any way beyond watching from the safety of the booth, because once you give them food, even if it's fake, even if it's an empty tray, they'll take more than that from you. They'll take a piece of your life, a piece of your mind, and you'll wake up at the table with them, chewing nothing forever. Rule 3. Do not speak to them if they speak to you, no matter what voice they use, because they know voices. They can wear them like masks. They can sound like your mother, your best friend, your dead lover, but it's not them. It never will be. And if you answer, you give them permission to move closer, and once they cross the boundary of the table, you won't be able to stop them. Rule 4. The lights will flicker sometimes, just once, like a stutter in the wiring. And if that happens, stay perfectly still, do not move, do not breathe loudly, because the flicker means they are walking among the tables unseen, and they can only sense motion, only hear the desperate gasp of someone who doesn't know to freeze. And if you move, if you so much as twitch, you'll feel a hand close around your throat in the dark, and you won't come back when the light's steady. Rule 5. If you hear laughter, ignore it, Cover your ears. Hum if you have to, but never laugh back, because the laughter is bait, and if you return it, they will know your exact seat, your exact heartbeat, and they will sit down across from you and never leave. Rule 6. Sometimes the smell will change. It will go from grease and dust to sweet, syrupy sugar, and if you smell that, leave the booth only long enough to dump salt in the center of the court, a full handful, no more, no less, because the sweetness means hunger is thick in the air, and salt is the only thing that sours their appetite. But if you forget the salt, they will feed anyway, and you don't want to see what they feed on. Rule 7. Around 3 in the morning, the soda machine may turn on by itself, pouring a drink into an empty cup, and if that happens, you must walk over, pour it out without drinking, without smelling, without letting a single drop touch your skin, because the liquid is not soda. It is them, condensed into something that pretends to be familiar, and if it touches you, it will seep through your pores and fill you from the inside until you are just another customer sitting at the tables. Rule 8. Never look directly into the reflection of the glass cases at the Chinese stall after 2 a.m., because what you see there is not your reflection, it is the version of you that stayed too long, the version of you that sat down to eat. And if you lock eyes with it for more than a heartbeat, it will switch places with you, and you will be the one trapped on the other side. Rule 9. If a child ever appears, alone, do not approach, do not pity, do not let it wander near your booth, because the child is the oldest of them, wearing a face they think is harmless, and the moment you show compassion, the moment you reach out, it will crawl inside you through your mouth, and you will never be alone again, not even in your own head. Rule 10. When dawn is close, around 5:30, you may hear knocking from the restroom hall, slow, deliberate, like someone trapped, but you cannot open the door, you cannot answer, because what knocks then is not asking for help, it is asking for entry, and if you let it out, it will walk the mall long after sunrise, and the mall won't be the only place that belongs to them anymore. Rule 11. Sometimes you will see me, Carson, or even Miles sitting at a table after hours, but it won't be us, it never will, and if you try to talk, if you acknowledge, if you even wave, then you have broken the oldest rule of all, never. Trust the familiar in this place, because they can mimic what you know, they can wear our shapes, but they cannot mimic patience, they cannot mimic restraint. So if we're here when we shouldn't be, the only safe thing to do is turn away. Rule 12. If all else fails, if the lights die, if the smell turns sweet, if they gather around you whispering in voices you know, then there is only one last resort. Lock yourself in the booth, close your eyes, and do not open them until Carson returns at dawn, because if you so much as peek, even through a crack, you will see them as they really are. And your mind will not survive that sight that I read those rules over and over again, each line carving itself into my memory like scars, because I knew then that this wasn't a job, it was survival training, it was a gauntlet someone had to walk every night to keep the mall balanced between their world and ours, and for reasons I still don't understand, that someone was me, and maybe if I obeyed every line, maybe if I treated those rules like scripture, I'd make it out alive. But Carson never told me what happens if you break more than one, if you slip more than once, and the way his hands trembled when he gave me that paper told me the truth. No. One lasts forever. No one follows them perfectly, and sooner or later, every worker breaks. And when they do, they don't quit, they don't leave, they just take a seat at the table with the others, chewing nothing, waiting for the next pour. Bastard to clock in. The first time a rule was broken, it wasn't even me who did it, but I swear to God it felt like the whole mall shifted, like the tiled floors subtly tilted, like gravity itself warped for a moment, and I knew, deep down in my bones, that nothing was ever going to be the same after that. It was Lyle, the part-time janitor who filled in on Tuesdays when my shift overlapped with the graveyard. He wasn't a bad guy, but he was careless, loud, too sure of himself, and he thought the laminated sheet of rules was just some twisted joke the management printed to haze new hires, and I remember telling him not to touch the fountain in the center court after midnight, not to look too long at the mannequins in the old Sears, not to ever, under any circumstances, answer the phone ringing in the security booth. But he laughed, said I was superstitious, and then at exactly 12:17, when the mall lights flickered and that sickly, humming silence settled over everything, he strolled into the fountain courtyard, muttering that he needed a smoke, and I watched, powerless, as he reached into the water, scooping out a coin. Ignoring the fact that rule number 7 clearly said never disturb the coins in the fountain. They are not for you. They are not wishes, they are anchors, and the sound that followed didn't belong in this world. It was a wet, gurgling moan, like a drain choking on something too big, and Lal jerked backward, swearing, his hand covered in a slick black sludge that clung to his skin like oil but moved on its own. Writhing, twisting, almost hungry, and he screamed, begged me to help. But all I could do was press myself against the glass booth, my throat dry, my stomach tight, because the rule was clear. If someone else breaks them, you can't intervene, you can only watch, or the punishment doubles. And I thought maybe that was an exaggeration until Lyle's body stiffened and his eyes went wide, the sludge slithering up his arm, his veins bulging, his chest convulsing until he was coughing up coins. Actual coins, the same kind that filled the fountain, except they were hot and steaming, clinking against the tiles as his mouth poured them out in a relentless metallic flood. And the thing inside the fountain was laughing, not with sound, but with ripples, violent, mocking ripples that spread across the water though nothing touched its surface. And then, as suddenly as it began, Lal collapsed, his body hollow, shriveled, like a paper bag left in the rain, and the coins scattered around him glowed faintly red, pulsing like heartbeats before sinking into the tile, vanishing, leaving no trace except for the faint smell of copper and bile in the air. And I just stood there shaking, realizing that the rules weren't just warnings, they were laws, binding, cosmic in weight, and breaking them unleashed things you couldn't take back. And that night was just the beginning, because once one rule was broken, it was like the mall itself had been given permission to unravel further. The phone in the booth began to ring, shrill, demanding. Even though I knew never to answer it, the mannequins in Sears twitched, their heads turning fractionally when I wasn't looking, their reflection in the glass windows not matching their positions in real space. And the food court smell grew rancid, like meat rotting in heat, though all the stalls were shuttered tight, and I realized that the rules weren't written to keep the horrors out. They were written to keep them contained. And once cracks started forming, once people like Lal loosened the locks, the things on the other side started slipping through, hungrier, stronger, bolder, until every corner of the mall became a test of survival, and I swore I'd never let myself slip, never let curiosity or carelessness tempt me. But the truth is, temptation always finds a way, and in that endless night, the mall was only just beginning to show me what happens when the rules are broken, when they are ignored, and when the price must finally be paid in full. I don't know how to describe the way the mall changed that night except to say that it stopped pretending, stopped hiding behind flickering lights and whispering shadows, and instead tore its mask away to reveal the raw machinery of the nightmare that had been building beneath every fluorescent bulb and food court stall since the first moment I walked in. And I swear to you, the air itself was vibrating with malice, as though the whole building had been waiting, watching, tallying every single broken rule and every single mistake we had made. And now, in Chapter 5, the tally was due to be paid in full. The first sign that things had escalated beyond anything survivable came when the glass ceiling above the atrium, where fake starlight usually shimmered, shattered without warning, raining down thousands of shards in a storm of glittering knives. Yet none of us were cut because the glass never touched us, instead hanging midair as though suspended in syrup, spinning slowly, reflecting warped versions of our terrified faces that weren't screaming yet but would be soon. And then all the shards shot upward again, sealing the ceiling back whole like nothing had ever happened, except the stars painted on it were different now, shifting slowly into constellations I had never seen before, shapes that looked less like animals or myth and more like diagrams of rules. The very rules I had been given written across the fake night sky and stars that pulsed red like open wounds, each one burning into my brain as though mocking me for daring to forget. And I realized with ice in my stomach that we weren't meant to just follow the rules. We were meant to live inside them. And now they were alive inside us. The mall came awake after that. I don't mean the shops opening or mannequins twitching. I mean the architecture itself breathing, the walls expanding and contracting like lungs, the tiled floors rippling as though some massive thing beneath The surface was turning over, and suddenly the escalators no longer led where they should but rose endlessly into blackness or sank into a darkness deeper than a grave. And the food court where I had first been stationed at my miserable night shift job had transformed into something like a cathedral of hunger. The tables bent into crooked altars, the chairs stacked like bone piles, and all the grease stained. Menus scrawled with messages that dripped in blood instead of ink. Breakers are feasted, eyes for eyes, no exit, no exit, repeating over and over until I wanted to claw at my face. Miguel grabbed me then, dragging me toward what used to be the maintenance corridor. But the second we entered, the hallway stretched long, impossibly long. Each door we passed marked with numbers that matched the rules I'd been given, and behind each door came the punishment. Door 3 rattled with something pounding its fists like meat mallets against steel because we had once let a shadow linger too long. Door 7 oozed thick red water because someone had looked into the fountain after hours. Door 11 whispered my name because I had dared to check my phone at 3:33 a.m. And each time I heard it, I felt my own heartbeat slip further out of rhythm, like the mall was syncing my pulse with its own. By the time we reached the end of the hall, Miguel was sobbing prayers in Spanish, but prayers didn't mean anything here. And when we shoved open the last door, we found ourselves not in storage, but back in the atrium. Only now the mannequins were gone from their windows, the fake shoppers absent, and instead every shadow stretched upward to form rows and rows of watching figures with blank faces, their heads cocked at the exact same angle, like puppets waiting for the strings to be pulled. And I screamed at them, begged to know what they wanted, but the only reply was the mall's PA system crackling on again. The same voice as always, female, cheerful, mall-like. But now it wasn't reminding me of sales or hours. Now it was reciting the rules one by one in a sing-song nursery rhyme voice. And with each rule spoken, the consequences began to unfold around us, as though the mall was staging executions for its amusement. A man I'd never seen before staggered into view near the fountain, his eyes boiling out of his sockets because he had broken Rule 2 by staring into the water. A woman collapsed, screaming with her skin splitting open into neat ribbons because she had once eaten food after closing. And worst of all, an employee uniform, my exact uniform, floated through the air stuffed with twitching black worms, reminding me that my own punishment was still pending, and I couldn't take it. I tried to run, but every step was swallowed. The floor sticky like tar, and the rules were everywhere now, scrawled across the ceiling, the walls, etched into my bones, burned into Miguel's sobbing face. And as the mannequins stepped closer, revealing mouths filled with teeth that were all human, all real, I realized this wasn't about surviving anymore. It never was. It was about performing for whatever fed on this place, about becoming a character in a ritual so vast and so old it made God seem like an afterthought. And the worst part, the part one can barely write down without vomiting, is that I felt something inside me agree with it. Something in me wanted to obey, wanted to kneel at those twisted altars, because maybe if I gave myself over completely, I wouldn't have to suffer what I'd just seen. But Miguel screamed in my ear, screamed my name, dragged me, forced me to move again, and we plunged into the black throat of a descending escalator, knowing it wouldn't lead anywhere safe, knowing it might not even lead anywhere human, but knowing too that Chapter 6 was waiting, and that whatever horrors were still to come, they weren't going to let me stop here, not while there were rules left to break, not while the mall still had more to feed on, not while we were still breathing and still screaming and still too alive to be allowed to leave. The air had gone cold, so cold that every breath left my lungs like shards of glass. Every exhale clouding the darkness that seemed thicker, hungrier, more alive than ever before, and I knew this was it, the final chapter of my miserable attempt at survival in this cursed place, because the rules weren't just suggestions anymore. They were chains, contracts written in a language older than the walls themselves, and I had broken too many, seen too much, heard things I wasn't supposed to hear, spoken names I wasn't supposed to speak, and now the consequences had come for me in full, merciless force. Because as I staggered through the halls that stretched longer than they had any right to, doors slamming shut behind me with echoes that shook my bones. I realized every single shadow was watching, waiting, salivating for me, whispering my name. In voices that weren't voices but the grinding of stone and the sighing of wind through a graveyard. And I remembered rule number 3. Never look directly at the things that whisper your name. But what else could I do when my own reflection in the cracked glass was mouthing it back at me? Lips moving silently before breaking into a grin that wasn't mine. Teeth too sharp, too many, stretching wider and wider until the mirror shattered outward, slicing my cheek and painting the walls with thin streaks of blood. And then the lights flickered, not in the way of old bulbs buzzing on bad wiring, but in deliberate pulses, almost like the place itself was breathing, in and out. And I remembered rule number 7. The building is alive. Do not match its breathing or it will notice you. But I had already started gasping in rhythm with the walls, my chest rising and falling against the steady inhale-exhale of the structure, until I forced myself to choke it off, coughing, gagging, trying to reset my lungs. But the damage was done. I could feel it, the weight of awareness pressing down on me, like the entire building had just opened its eyes for the first time in years and chosen me as the first thing it wanted to devour. And I ran, feet pounding on warped tiles, each step splashing in puddles that hadn't been there seconds before, black water rising from the cracks like veins bursting, cold enough to numb my ankles as I waded through, doors on either side banging, open and shut like jaws snapping, glimpses inside showing things I cannot describe without clawing at my own mind, twisted things strapped to tables, eyes sewn open, mouths gnawed shut, their limbs jerking as though they were trying to scream at me not to look, not to enter. And rule number 2 came roaring back. Never acknowledge the patients. They are not real anymore. But one of them did look real, a little girl, pale and trembling, clutching a ragged doll in her hands, eyes wide with tears as she whispered, "Please help me." And against every fiber of my will I slowed, just for a second, because how could I ignore that? How could I not? And the moment my hand twitched toward her, her skin split like wet paper, a gaping mouth opening from her chest as hundreds of black, slimy fingers shot out, grabbing at the air, grabbing for me, and I screamed, stumbling back as the doll's head turned toward me, its painted smile splitting ear to ear, whispering my name in 100 overlapping voices, and I ran again, heart hammering so loud I thought it would burst, every corridor twisting into spirals, doors leading into the same hallway I had just sprinted down, ceiling tiles falling like broken teeth, the stench of rot growing thicker, heavier, choking me. And then the sirens began, distant at first, then deafening, screaming through the air like the wail of something ancient and hungry. And I remembered rule number 5. When the sirens sound, you must be still, you must be silent, or you will be chosen. But how do you stay still when everything inside you is telling you to flee, to hide, to claw your way out by any means? I pressed myself against the wall, trying to steady my shaking breath, hands over my mouth. But the sirens weren't just sound. They were pressure, waves of force rattling my bones, squeezing my heart, pulling me toward the ground, and I realized, with horror, that they weren't trying to warn anyone. They were calling, summoning, dragging something closer with each rising pitch. And then the lights went out completely, plunging me into a darkness that was total, absolute, suffocating. Except for one faint glow down the hallway, a flicker of pale, golden light like a candle. And I knew rule number 10. Never follow the light. It does not lead outside, it leads down. But I couldn't help it. My body moved on its own, my legs trembling forward step by step, as if strings had been hooked through my joints, and the whispers returned, not from the walls this time, but from inside my own skull. Every voice I had ever known, my mother, my father, friends long dead, telling me it was safe, telling me it was finally over, that all I had to do was step into the glow. And when I did, the floor fell out beneath me, sending me tumbling into nothingness. Cold air tearing at my skin as I dropped into a pit that had no bottom, falling and falling until I landed on something wet and soft, something that writhed under my weight. And when I scrambled to my feet, I realized it wasn't a floor at all, but flesh, a living mass that pulsed with each beat like a titanic heart, veins glowing faintly beneath the surface, And I understood now what this place really was: not a hospital, not an asylum, but a body, a prison of flesh and memory, a labyrinth, designed to consume anyone foolish enough to break its rules. And I had broken nearly all of them. And as the whispers rose into screams, the walls of the chamber split open, revealing faces stretched across muscle and sinew. All the others who had come before me, their eyes rolling, mouths opening to wail. Soundlessly as their features melted back into the tissue, absorbed for eternity. And the final rule I had never wanted to believe, rule number 13, carved into my memory in jagged letters, rang clear: there is no leaving. Once you are inside, you belong here. And I did. I belonged now. The building had claimed me. And as the flesh rose around me, tendrils pulling me back into the living walls, my lungs filled with rot, my skin peeled back into its screaming choir. And my last thought, before the darkness closed over me forever, was that maybe I hadn't been hired at all. Maybe I had been chosen from the start, lured by the promise of a job, trapped by the rules I was never meant to follow. And as the final light blinked out, I understood. This place doesn't just eat people, it makes them part of the rules. And now my voice, too, will whisper in the dark halls to the next poor soul who dares to work the night shift here, doomed to fail, doomed to join us, because there is no ending except this one.